Fire comes first, not slowly, not as a warning. It erupts, orange and devastating, across wooden rooftops that have stood for a century, turning a floating city into a catastrophe in the span of seconds. People are screaming, children are running. A massive, ancient shade carves through the smoke overhead, its wingspan blotting out what little moonlight the clouds haven't already swallowed. And if you're watching this for the first time, there's a moment, just a few seconds in, where your brain is still catching up to what your eyes are processing. Because this isn't an action sequence building towards something. This is something. This is the thing you've been waiting for since the first movie teased it 3 years ago. That's how The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies opens. No preamble, no recap, no gentle easing into the world. It drops you into the burning of Lake Town like you were already there, watching Smaug, the last great dragon of Middle-earth, finally do what everyone who read the book knew he was always going to do. And the fact that this sequence arrives within the first 10 minutes of the film, before the title card, before most of the characters even appear on screen, tells you exactly what kind of movie Peter Jackson decided to make with his third and final Hobbit film. This is a movie about consequences, not about quests or discovery or the wonder of a world that stretches further than you can see. Those were the textures of the first two films. This one is about what happens after, what it costs to get what you wanted, what you're willing to do to keep it, and whether the person you were before the journey is still recognizable to you once the journey ends. Let's take a step back for a moment, because to really understand what Battle of the Five Armies is doing and what it's trying to be, you have to appreciate the position it was in when it arrived in theaters on December 17, 2014. Peter Jackson had been living in Middle-earth for 14 years. 14! He'd made The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King between 2001 and 2003, turning J.R.R. Tolkien's sprawling, mythological trilogy into one of the most successful and critically celebrated film franchises in cinema history. The Return of the King won 11 Academy Awards. The films made careers, launched actors into stardom, turned New Zealand into a permanent cinematic destination, and introduced an entire generation to the concept that fantasy, real, serious, emotionally resonant fantasy, belonged on the biggest screens in the world. Then came The Hobbit. Jackson didn't originally plan to direct it. Guillermo del Toro was attached for years, and there are entire alternate timelines worth imagining about what that version would have looked like. Darker, stranger, more visually idiosyncratic. But circumstances changed, del Toro departed, and Jackson stepped back in. The decision to split what is, at its core, a relatively slim children's novel into 3 feature-length films was controversial from the start. Fans were skeptical, critics were sharper. And by the time the Battle of the Five Armies arrived, the 3-film structure had already taken significant critical fire. The first film was seen as too slow and overstuffed, the second as spectacular but narratively distended. The question hanging over the finale wasn't just, will it be good? But something more fundamental, can it stick the landing? What's remarkable, looking back now, is how much Battle of the Five Armies does stick it. Not perfectly, not without compromise, not without the padding that became a franchise habit, but emotionally, thematically, and in terms of pure cinematic ambition, it earns its place in Jackson's Middle-earth catalog. And the reason why is mostly one character and one performance and one arc that stands as the beating dramatic heart of everything these 3 films were trying to be. Thorin Oakenshield. We'll spend a lot of time with him in this essay. We have to. Because Thorin's story, and specifically what happens to Thorin in this film, is the key that unlocks every other interesting thing Battle of the Five Armies has to say. He's a king who reclaims his kingdom and loses his mind in the same breath. A leader whose courage becomes indistinguishable from his madness. A warrior who has to die to remember who he was. Richard Armitage plays the arc with a ferocity and a precision that doesn't get talked about enough. And by the time the film reaches its climax, what Armitage does with those final scenes carries a grief so genuine it almost doesn't belong in a blockbuster. Almost. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because first, there's Smaug, the dragon. The one who's been sleeping on a mountain of gold for 60 years. The one who incinerated an entire civilization when the dwarves of Erebor made the catastrophic miscalculation of trying to wake him up. The one who, in The Desolation of Smaug, was tricked, infuriated, and sent streaking toward Lake Town with murder in his eyes and fire in his throat. When Battle of the Five Armies opens, that's exactly where we pick up, mid-catastrophe, no runway, no time to settle in. The Smaug sequence that opens the film is, shot for shot, technically extraordinary. Andrew Lesnie's cinematography, and this was among his final work before his death in 2015, captures the attack with a scope that feels genuinely massive. Weta-digital Smaug remains one of the finest digital creatures ever put on screen. The scales, the membrane of the wings catching firelight, the reptilian intelligence in those amber eyes. The 4:8 frames per second format that Jackson used for all three Hobbit films, widely debated, frequently criticized for making everything look too vivid, too present, too much like high-definition television, actually works for this sequence in a specific and interesting way. The hyper-realism of 4:8 FPS makes the destruction feel more immediate, more tactile, more dangerous. You don't get the romantic, soft-focused distance of traditional cinema here. You're in it. And then Bard kills him with a black arrow, shot from a makeshift bow using his own son's shoulder as a stand. It's both absurd and completely, genuinely thrilling, which is a trick the best action cinema pulls off all the time and makes look effortless. Bard the Bowman, played with weathered conviction by Luke Evans, earns his hero moment without it feeling cheap, because the film has done the work. We know what this shot costs. We know the weight of what Bard is carrying in that moment. Not just the physical improbability of the shot, but the fact that he's the last line of defense between his children and oblivion, and that has a way of clarifying a person's aim. Smaug falls. The dragon, the terror, the myth, the reason the whole journey began, crashes into the freezing lake below, dead. And then the movie pauses. There's a moment of strange, charged silence in Lake Town's aftermath, smoke everywhere, ruins floating in dark water, people pulling each other from the wreckage, and you realize that with Smaug gone, the thing that everyone in the story has been afraid of, the obstacle that defined the entire quest, is over. Gone in the first 15 minutes of the final chapter. So what's left? Everything, as it turns out. The treasure, the mountain, 5 armies worth of history, grievance, and desperation, all converging on a single point of geography. And one dwarf king sitting on a throne of gold, slowly losing the thread of who he is. This is where Battle of the 5 Armies makes its most interesting structural choice. Most franchise finales spend their runtime on escalation, bigger action, higher stakes, longer climaxes. And this film absolutely delivers those things. The battle that eventually consumes the film's second half is enormous, multi-fronted, and visually inventive in ways that action cinema doesn't always attempt. But the film keeps pulling back from the spectacle to check in on something smaller and quieter and far more devastating. Thorin pacing the halls of Erebor, growing paranoid, growing cold, growing into something his company doesn't recognize. That contrast, the world outside fracturing into war while the world inside Erebor fractures into madness, is the film's central creative tension. And it's what elevates it above what it could have been, which was just a very expensive, very beautiful delivery mechanism for a conclusion everyone already knew was coming. Because here's the thing about adapting The Hobbit, specifically its final act. Anyone who's read the book knows roughly what happened. Smaug dies. The armies gather. There's a battle. Some beloved characters don't make it. Bilbo goes home. The map always leads to the same place. What Peter Jackson and his co-writers Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Guillermo del Toro had to do with this final film was find a way to make the journey feel emotionally inevitable rather than mechanically predetermined. They had to make you feel the loss before it happened, and then make it hit harder anyway. Some of what they added to Tolkien's text lands beautiful. The expansion of Thorin's dragon sickness into a full psychological portrait, the hallucinations, the paranoia, the moment he nearly murders Bilbo, gives Richard Armitage material that the source novel never really provided, and he runs with it to extraordinary effect. The Tauriel and Kili relationship, controversial among purists and structurally awkward in the previous film, pays emotional dividends in 5 Armies because it gives the dwarven deaths weight that they might not otherwise have had for a general audience. When Kili dies protecting Tauriel, and you see Evangeline Lilly's face in that moment, it doesn't matter that these characters don't exist in Tolkien's text. The grief is real, the performance is real, and real is what matters in cinema. Some of what they added lands less cleanly. The Dol Guldur sequence, where Galadriel, Saruman, Elrond, and Radagast confront the necromancer revealed as Sauron, is visually spectacular but narratively detached, floating in a different tonal register from everything around it. It feels like it belongs in a different movie. The romantic subplot with Alfred, the conniving assistant to Lake Town's master, continues past the point where it earns its screen time. These are the stitches showing through the fabric, and they're visible if you're looking. But here's why this film still matters, still holds up, and still rewards serious engagement 12 years after its release. It's the end of something that mattered. Not just a storyline, not just a franchise, an era. The Middle-earth films, all 6 of them, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit combined, represent something that doesn't happen very often in popular culture. A filmmaker with genuine vision, genuine passion, and genuine understanding of the source material, given the resources to build an entire world from scratch and share it with 1 billion people over more than a decade. Jackson, Walsh, Boyens, Lesney, Shore, and the thousands of craftspeople at Weta Workshop and Weta Digital built something that will outlast all of us. The Shire, Rivendell, Moria, Rohan, Minas Tirith, Erebor. These aren't just movie sets. They're locations that people carry around in their imaginations like memories of real places. The Battle of the Five Armies is the last time we ever see any of it. The last time we hear Howard Shore's dwarven themes swell in a concert hall worthy orchestral arrangement. The last time we see the Blue Mountains catching dawn light. The last time Bilbo Baggins, Ian Holm in Lord of the Rings, Martin Freeman in The Hobbit, stands at a threshold between the wide world and the warm smallness of Bag End, choosing between them. That's an enormous amount of emotional freight for any film to carry. And the fact that Battle of the Five Armies carries most of it without collapsing under the weight is, when you think about what it was up against, genuinely impressive. So, let's go into the mountain. Let's watch a king lose himself and find himself again in the same afternoon. Let's watch a hobbit. An ordinary, unremarkable, unadventurous hobbit from the Shire. Do the bravest thing anyone does in 3 films, tell a dragon-sick king a truth he doesn't want to hear. Let's watch 5 armies reduce a valley to rubble and examine, honestly, what that carnage means and what it cost and what it built. And at the end, let's talk about what it means to say goodbye to a world, not just in the story, but as an audience, as people who spent 14 years visiting a place that doesn't exist and somehow, against all rational explanation, fell completely in love with it. The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies, is many things. It's imperfect, it's ambitious, it's spectacular, it's occasionally frustrating, and it's genuinely, quietly heartbreaking in ways that catch you off guard. It's also, when everything's said and done, exactly the ending Middle-earth deserved. The fire goes out faster than anyone expected. One moment, Smaug is a catastrophe, a living weapon of molten vengeance carving Lake Town into ash and splinters. The next, a single black arrow punches through the gap in his scales and the dragon crumples mid-flight, his roar folding into something almost like surprise before the weight of his own body pulls him into the water below. The lake swallows him, the ripples fan out, and a city that was burning 30 seconds ago goes quiet in the particular way that only places do after something enormous and terrible has just been narrowly survived. It's over. The dragon is dead, and nobody, not Bard, not the people of Lake Town, not the dwarves watching from the mountain, knows what to do next. That's the exact emotional temperature Battle of the Five Armies starts with, and it's a more interesting place to begin than it might initially appear, because the death of Smaug isn't a moment of celebration, it's a moment of vacuum. The defining threat that organized everyone's fear and everyone's purpose for 2 films is just gone. And what floods into that vacuum? Greed, grief, old grudges, political calculation, and one king's accelerating psychological collapse is what the rest of the film is built from. Let's start in Lake Town, because that's where the human cost is most immediate. The aftermath of Smaug's attack is genuinely harrowing in the way the film depicts it, not with the clean heroism of action cinema, but with the messy, waterlogged chaos of actual disaster. Families separated, buildings half submerged. The master of Lake Town, Stephen Fry, playing the corrupt official with venomous comic precision right up to his final screen moments, scrambles for his gold while his people burn, abandoning the city he ran into the lake he's now drowning in. There's dark poetry in that. His death isn't triumphant. It's just squalid, a greedy man dying with his greed in his hands. The film doesn't linger on it long, which is smart. It registers and moves on, because the real story of Lake Town's survivors isn't the master's end. It's Bard's beginning. Luke Evans, who played Bard the Bowman across the second and third films, doesn't get talked about enough in discussions of the Hobbit trilogy's performances. He's doing something quiet and consistent and essential, playing a man who genuinely doesn't want power, who has to be pushed toward every act of leadership like it's something being done to him rather than chosen. There's no glory hunger in Bard. When he emerges from the ruins after killing Smaug, soaked and exhausted, his kids wrapped around him, the expression Evans holds isn't triumph. It's something closer to relief mixed with dread. He's alive. They're alive. Now what? That, now what, is the question that drives Lake Town's portion of the first act. The survivors need shelter, and the answer is Dale, the ancient city that sits in the shadow of the lonely mountain, abandoned since the dragon's attack 60 years before. There's something quietly mournful about watching people file into Dale's empty streets and shuttered buildings. This is a ghost town, a place that was vibrant and alive before the same dragon these people just survived destroyed it. They're sheltering in a wound, and they know it. While Bard's people settle into the ruins, a very different kind of settling is happening inside Erebor itself. The dwarves made it. Against every probability, every tactical mistake, every moment where the quest should have ended in disaster, they made it. Erebor is theirs. The mountain is reclaimed. Thorin Oakenshield sits on the throne of his ancestors, surrounded by more gold than most human minds can genuinely conceptualize, and he is not okay. He is not remotely okay. The dragon sickness, the Tolkien term for the obsessive madness that the proximity of the great treasure induces, isn't described in the source novel with particular psychological depth. In the book, Thorin's greed escalates relatively quickly into the political standoff that precipitates the titular battle. Peter Jackson's adaptation takes a different path. It slows down. It zooms in. It gives Thorin's disintegration the kind of careful, clinical attention that you'd normally associate with character drama rather than epic fantasy. And in doing so, it turns what could have been a plot mechanism into the most compelling thread in the film. Watch what happens in these early Erebor scenes. Watch how Jackson frames Thorin against the gold. He's never quite standing on solid ground in these shots. There's always a sense of precariousness, of surfaces that shift underfoot. The gold itself is everywhere, and the film's production design, led by Dan Hanna, working from years of world-building established across all three films, creates this environment of oppressive abundance. There's too much of everything. Too much gold, too much depth, too many corridors vanishing into shadow. It's a palace that feels like a labyrinth, a treasure chamber that feels like a trap. Every visual choice in these scenes tells you the same thing. This place is consuming him. Richard Armitage plays Thorin's early deterioration with extraordinary subtlety. He doesn't go big with the madness, not yet. Instead, he plays it as a kind of heightened hypervigilance, eyes always moving, jaw always tight, every conversation charged with the possibility of accusation. When he speaks to his companions in these scenes, there's a new edge in his voice, something that wasn't there in the warmth and exasperation of the earlier films. Thorin has always been proud, always been demanding. But what's emerging now is different. It's the pride curdling into suspicion, the leadership calcifying into possessiveness. He's not commanding his people, he's watching them, counting, measuring, and he can't find the Arkenstone. This becomes the motor of the entire first act. The Arkenstone, the great white gem, the heart of the mountain, the symbol of the dwarves' rightful claim to Erebor, is missing. Thorin knows it's in the mountain. He knows one of his company has it. And the audience knows, of course, that Bilbo took it from the treasure hoard at the end of the previous film, tucked it away in his breast pocket with the quiet, practical reasoning of a hobbit who saw a crisis brewing before anyone else did. Bilbo carrying the Arkenstone is one of the film's most interesting moral situations, and it's worth pausing here to appreciate what Martin Freeman does with it. Because Bilbo knows what the stone does to Thorin, what it will do if Thorin gets it back, and yet he also knows that technically, legally, by the terms of their contract, the stone belongs to Thorin. He's holding something that isn't his. He stole it, but he stole it for good reasons. The whole dilemma sits on Freeman's face in these early scenes, the quiet anxiety of someone who has information that could blow everything apart, who's simultaneously guilty and convinced he's doing the right thing, who is trying to protect a friend who's increasingly difficult to recognize as a friend. Freeman's Bilbo has always been the emotional truth-teller of the Hobbit trilogy, the ordinary person in an extraordinary situation, the one whose reactions calibrate the audience's responses. When Bilbo looks scared, you lean forward. When Bilbo looks heartbroken, you feel it. In these early mountain scenes, Freeman plays Bilbo as someone running quiet internal calculations constantly. Is it time? Do I tell him? Do I wait? How much worse does this get before I have to act? It's a masterclass in the performance of not quite doing anything while everything in your face communicates the cost. Meanwhile, outside the mountain, the world is reorganizing itself. News travels fast in Middle-earth, and the news of Smaug's death reaches the Elven King Thranduil faster than anyone in Erebor anticipated. Thranduil, played by Lee Pace with an iciness so precise and so total, it reads less like coldness and more like a chosen aesthetic, arrives at the mountain's doorstep with an army of Mirkwood elves and a grievance that predates the dragon by century. Locked in Erebor's vaults are white gems that belong to his people, moonstones or starlight jewels, depending on which part of Tolkien you're reading, and Thranduil is here to collect them, politely, for now, but with 10,000 spears behind him in case politeness proves insufficient. The Thranduil scenes are consistently fascinating because Lee Pace is playing a character who is essentially a controlled catastrophe. There's fury underneath Thranduil's composure. Grief, really, if you read between the lines of his obsession with those gems. But he contains it so completely that you're never quite sure whether you're watching wisdom or denial. His interactions with Bard, who represents Lake Town's legitimate claim to a share of the treasure as compensation for what Smaug destroyed, are interesting precisely because Bard is the moral weight in those scenes and Thranduil is the political calculation. Bard wants justice for his people. Thranduil wants his jewels. The fact that their goals briefly align doesn't mean their motivations are similar, and Pace and Evans play that tension beautifully in the way they don't quite look at each other directly. Now Thorin, already paranoid and deteriorating, is facing an army at his gates. And then Gandalf arrives. Or rather, Gandalf is delivered, recovered from the fortress of Dol Guldur, where the White Council extracted him from the necromancer's grip in the film's most visually overwhelming sequence. We'll examine the Dol Guldur sequence in more detail in the technical section of this essay, because what happens there is worth its own analysis. For now, what matters is that Gandalf rides hard for Erebor and arrives not as the reassuring figure of authority that he's been across 6 films, but as someone genuinely alarmed. Ian McKellen plays these scenes with an urgency that's different from his usual gravitas. Gandalf is scared. He's seen what's coming. Not just the armies converging on the mountain, but what's rising again in the east, the shadow that Smaug's death has just made infinitely more accessible in strategic terms. The geography matters here, and the film is smart to establish it clearly. Smaug sitting on the mountain was in some ways a stabilizing force, an anarchic one, but a real one. No one could use Erebor while a dragon occupied it. Now that the dragon is gone, the mountain's strategic value is back in play, and there are 5 distinct factions with 5 distinct claims, all converging on it simultaneously. The dwarves of Thorin's company, who reclaimed it. The men of Laketown, who need compensation. The elves of Mirkwood, who want their gems. The dwarves of the Iron Hills, under Dian Ironfoot, marching to reinforce Thorin. And somewhere in the gray distance, an orc army under the command of Azog, the pale orc who's been hunting Thorin across 3 films. Who doesn't want the mountain for its treasure? Who wants it for its position? Who understands, in a way that none of the other factions fully do yet, that Erebor isn't just a mine. It's a fortress, and whoever holds it when the war that's coming arrives will have an enormous advantage. This is where the story structure of Battle of the 5 Armies is doing something quite sophisticated under the surface spectacle. The 5 armies aren't just a climax, they're a diagnosis. Each army represents a different manifestation of the same fundamental problem. The inability to see past your own claim to recognize what everyone shares. Thorin can't see past the treasure. Thranduil can't see past the gems. The men can't see past survival. Even the dwarves of the Iron Hills, marching in good faith to support their kin, don't initially have the full picture. And Azog doesn't need to see past anything, because he's not here for the same thing they're all arguing about. He's here because he was sent by something that none of them know has woken up again. Gandalf knows, and nobody will listen. That's the world at the end of Act 1. A ruined city filling with survivors, a mountain filling with gold and madness, armies on the march from 5 directions, and one very small person, a hobbit, barely 5 feet tall, standing in a mountain corridor, holding a glowing white stone in his palm, trying to figure out if there's still a way to stop what's coming. Bilbo's decision to take the Arkenstone to the enemy camp, to carry it to Bard and Thranduil before Thorin knows, to use it as a bargaining chip to prevent war, is one of the most psychologically precise moments in the Hobbit trilogy. Because it is, by any conventional measure, a betrayal. He's taking something that contractually belongs to Thorin and using it against him. He's doing it from love. He's doing it because he sees what Thorin can't see anymore, that the mountain isn't worth dying for, that the treasure isn't worth what it's costing the king who reclaimed it, that a friend, a true friend, sometimes has to do the impossible thing. We'll spend substantial time with this moment in the character section. For now, just hold it. The shape of it. The moral weight of someone choosing between loyalty and love, between keeping a secret and telling a truth that might shatter everything. That weight is where Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins. The armies are gathering. The gates of Erebor are sealed. Thorin stands on a parapet and looks out at a world that he won the right to and still can't quite have. Below him, somewhere in the dark, Bilbo is walking toward the enemy. And the mountain watches all of it without expression, the way mountains always do. There's a moment, just before Bilbo slips out of Erebor's hidden passage into the frozen dark, where he stops, just for a second. He looks back at the mountain, at the firelight spilling through the stone corridors, at the silhouettes of the dwarves he's traveled with through impossible circumstances, at the life he's built inside this quest, and something passes across Martin Freeman's face that isn't quite fear and isn't quite resolve. It's the expression of someone who has made a decision they can't unmake, and who is standing at the exact edge of the moment before it becomes irreversible. Then he goes. What Bilbo does next is, stripped of all its fantasy trappings, an act of radical friendship. He crosses the battlefield threshold at night, alone, carrying the one object that all parties want most, and he walks directly into the camp of the men and elves who are technically his king's enemies. He approaches Gandalf first, and this exchange is crucial, because Gandalf's reaction tells us everything. The wizard doesn't look shocked when Bilbo produces the Arkenstone. He looks sad. resigned, like someone who already suspected this was the only remaining move on the board. Ian McKellen plays this scene without any of Gandalf's usual theatrical authority. There's no staff planting, no booming declaration. He just looks at Bilbo quietly and says, in effect, "You know what this will do to him." Bilbo says he knows. That one admission, so quiet, so Freeman, so utterly at odds with the battle speech register of everything around it, is one of the most emotionally honest moments in the entire Hobbit trilogy. Bilbo isn't naive. He understands the cost. He's doing it anyway. The Arkenstone is presented to Thranduil and Bard in the gray pre-dawn of the enemy camp, and there's something almost parliamentary about the scene staging. 3 parties sitting around a table, one gem on the surface between them, everyone trying to calculate what it means and what it changes. Bard's instinct is to use it as a genuine bargaining tool, offer Thorin the stone in exchange for a share of the treasure that covers what Lake Town lost. Thranduil, characteristically, is more clinical. He sees it as leverage. He'd be happy to use it as a key that opens the mountain's gates and ends this standoff before anyone has to bleed. His army is comfortable. The cold doesn't bother elves. He can wait. What none of them has fully accounted for is the degree to which the Arkenstone no longer functions as a bargaining chip in Thorin's mind. It's become something different, symbolic and urgent in a way that goes beyond its political and contractual meaning. Thorin doesn't simply want the stone back. He needs it. The absence of it is part of what's unraveling him. The sense that something essential is missing, that the restoration of Erebor is incomplete, that the throne doesn't feel real without it. You can argue, and the film subtly suggests, that the Arkenstone's symbolic power over Thorin is itself a facet of the dragon sickness. Smaug didn't just hoard gold. He attached meaning to objects, fetishized possessions, believed that ownership was identity. Thorin is replicating that psychology without realizing it. The stone has become his self-concept, which means Bilbo stealing it wasn't just a practical act, it was an act of psychic surgery, whether he knew it or not. Morning comes. Bard approaches the gates of Erebor, Arkenstone in hand, to negotiate. And this is where Richard Armitage delivers what might be the single most finely calibrated sequence of his performance in the trilogy. Thorin's response to seeing the Arkenstone isn't immediate fury. It's something more unsettling than that, a kind of fractured recognition. Like a person seeing something they've dreamed about so intensely that the real thing feels simultaneously confirming and wrong. He reaches for it, draws it back, looks at Bard, looks at the stone again, and then the calculation changes visibly in his eyes. Someone outside the mountain has it, which means someone inside gave it away, which means someone in his company betrayed him. The pivot is instantaneous. The grief, and there is grief there, briefly, genuinely visible in Armitage's expression, gets crushed under the paranoia. And Thorin turns on his company with a suspicion so cold and absolute that the dwarves who have followed him across 3 films take a visible step backward, not from Smaug, not from Azog, from Thorin, from their king. When Bilbo steps forward, when this small, gentle, thoroughly unarmed hobbit walks out of the crowd and quietly says, "I took it," the camera holds on Thorin's face for a long beat. And what you see there is devastating if you've been paying attention across all 3 films. It's not just anger. It's the look of a man who has been betrayed by the person he least expected to betray him. Because for all Thorin's pride and stubbornness and impossible standards, Bilbo has been the one company member he's allowed past his defenses, the one whose opinion has mattered. Their relationship, gruff and skeptical becoming something warmer and harder to name, is the quiet emotional spine of the entire Hobbit story. And in this moment, Thorin shatters it. He grabs Bilbo, drags him to the parapet's edge, holds him over a very long drop. The dwarves freeze. Nobody moves, because they're not sure, in this moment, that their king won't do it, and neither is Bilbo. Jackson films this sequence with an intimacy that refuses to be epic. No swelling score, no wide establishing shots, just 2 faces, very close together, one full of a rage that is eating the man from the inside out, and one that is, and this is what makes Freeman's performance in this moment extraordinary, not afraid in the way you'd expect. Bilbo isn't panicking. He's heartbroken. He looks at Thorin the way you look at someone you love who is doing something irreparable, and you haven't quite lost hope that they'll stop, but you're watching hope get very small. Thorin pulls back, doesn't drop him. Whether it's the last thread of himself that holds him back, or whether, as the film suggests, Bilbo's refusal to be terrified somehow reaches through the madness, something stops him. The moment passes. But it leaves a mark. On Bilbo, certainly. On the audience, absolutely. And on Thorin, who in that near murder sees his own reflection clearly enough to be disgusted by it, even if he can't yet act on the disgust. Then Dain Ironfoot arrives. The dwarves of the Iron Hills pour into the valley in a sequence that is one of the film's great moments of tonal comic relief. Billy Connolly voicing Diane with such magnificent belligerence that you understand immediately why they cast him and nobody else. Diane doesn't assess the situation, he doesn't negotiate. He looks at the assembled elven army, declares them welcome to leave, and when they don't, charges directly at them with the cheerful aggression of a man who has never seriously considered that he might lose a fight. This is the spark. This is the moment where the standoff, which might have been resolved through the kind of tense political maneuvering the film has been building toward, tips instead into violence, because everyone is scared and tired and cold and sitting on legitimate grievances, and one heavily armored dwarf just decided the conversation was over. The battle erupts. And here's where Battle of the Five Armies does something genuinely ambitious. It tries to make you feel the chaos of a multi-front, large-scale medieval engagement while keeping you emotionally tethered to individual human, or dwarven or elvish, experiences within it. Jackson and editor Jabez Olson cut between the macro and the micro with enough fluency that you don't lose the geography, but you also never get so lost in the geometry of armies that you forget who you care about. The early battle choreography is kinetic, in the best sense. The elven infantry moving in geometric precision, spears lowering in synchronized waves against the dwarven charge, looks like something a military historian and a ballet choreographer designed together. There's genuine visual intelligence in how Jackson stages the initial clash. The elves don't just win because they're elves. They win because they're disciplined, because they've done this 10,000 times, because warfare is to them what accounting is to a particularly organized human. A matter of process and institutional memory. Watching a dwarven charge break against an elven shield wall isn't humiliating exactly, but it makes a point about the difference between courage and strategy. Then, the ground opens up. Azog's masterstroke. And it is, coldly, a masterstroke. Is the tunnels. Beneath the valley floor, orc warriors have been digging through the previous night, and now they burst upward through the earth like a dark tide flooding the battlefield from below. In an instant, the tactical landscape inverts. Nobody is fighting the enemy they prepared to fight. The armies that were squaring off against each other are suddenly surrounded by a third force from an unexpected direction, and the discipline that made the elven formation so effective becomes a liability when the threat is coming from underneath your feet. Jackson films the tunnel emergence with a visual imagination that's worth stopping to appreciate. The camera goes wide to show the valley floor fracturing in long lines, then cuts quickly to ground level where the emerging orcs are massive and fast and overwhelmingly close. It's the cinematic equivalent of an ambush. The audience experiences the surprise almost simultaneously with the characters, which is much harder to engineer than it sounds. What this moment also does narratively is collapse the distinction between the five factions in an instant. Suddenly, the dwarves and elves and men who were about to kill each other over treasure and gems are fighting for survival on the same patch of ground. The political argument is still happening, in a sense. It just got physically interrupted, which makes the eventual moments of cooperation between former enemies feel earned rather than sentimental. Nobody chose to be on the same side. Circumstances made that choice for them. Inside Erebor, meanwhile, Thorin has gone somewhere else entirely. The film's most formally daring sequence, a brief but striking interior vision where Thorin walks through a golden sea that morphs into the same hallucination of drowning in treasure that Smaug himself described across the previous film, is the moment where the dragon sickness is made fully visible and fully psychological. Thorin isn't just paranoid anymore. He's inhabiting a state where his mind and Smaug's have genuinely overlapped. The gold filling his lungs is Smaug's gold. The obsession consuming him is Smaug's obsession. He has become, without meaning to, the inheritor of the dragon's soul as well as the dragon's horde. What breaks him out of it isn't Gandalf or strategy or political calculation. It's Bilbo's voice. Faint, outside, through the stone and the smoke and the battle raging below, just calling his name, just being there. And that small, entirely uncinematic sound cuts through everything the dragon sickness has built. Armitage's performance in the moment, Thorin snaps back. When the golden sea recedes and he's standing in a cold stone corridor again, and the weight of what he's done and almost done crashes down on him, is played with a physical quality that's almost balletic in its restraint. He doesn't fall, he doesn't cry, he just breathes, slowly, deliberately, like a man reminding himself what it feels like to be himself. Then he puts on his armor and goes to war. Not for the mountain this time, not for the treasure, not for the Arkenstone or the throne or the lineage of Durin. He goes because his people are dying down in the valley, and because a very small person called his name, and because, though the dragon sickness took almost everything, it didn't quite reach the part of him that knows what loyalty actually means. Thorin's emergence from Erebor's gates at the head of his company is the film's most purely satisfying moment. The dwarves coming over the ramparts. Howard Shore's score pivoting from its battle chaos register to the dwarven themes, full-throated and driving. The company formed up around their king, and for one irreplaceable beat, everybody in the valley pausing to look at them. It's a hero shot, and Jackson doesn't apologize for it. He shouldn't. This is what the three films have been building toward. Not the battle itself, but this specific moment of Thorin Oakenshield being fully himself again, choosing correctly, choosing his people over his gold. The crowd-pleasing mechanics of it don't diminish the emotional substance, they amplify it, because the emotional substance was so carefully and deliberately constructed across the film's entire first half that the release feels genuinely earned. You wanted this, and you got it, and somehow knowing you were going to get it doesn't make it land any less hard. But, and this is critical, the film doesn't let the heroism be clean. Because even as Thorin leads the charge that turns the battle's tide, Azog is watching, calculating, drawing the commanders away from the main force and toward the high ground, toward Ravenhill, where the Pale Orc and his General Bolg are directing the assault like chess pieces from above. It's a trap, a very good one, designed specifically for a king who has just remembered his courage and is therefore exactly susceptible to the thing courage makes you do, advance when you should hold. Thorin recognizes the trap, and he goes anyway, because stopping the Orc commanders is the only way to end the battle before the casualties become catastrophic, because sometimes the right strategic choice and the suicidal choice are the same choice. Because Thorin Oakenshield has never once, across three films, chosen the safe option when the brave one was available, and whatever the dragon sickness took from him, it didn't take that. He takes Fili, Kili, Dwalin, and Bilbo. The five of them head for Ravenhill. And the battle below keeps churning, its outcome uncertain, the eagle shapes that appear on the horizon not yet close enough to matter, the tide not yet turned. The hardest part of this story is still ahead. Ravenhill is a ruin. Stone towers half collapsed, walkways crumbling over sheer drops, ice sheeting every surface so that every step is a negotiation between forward momentum and oblivion. It's not the kind of place you choose for a fight, which is exactly why Azog chose it. The Pale Orc has spent three films being underestimated as a straightforward monster, a physical threat, a personal vendetta, a pale shape in the dark. But here, directing an army from high ground, using the terrain as a weapon before a single blade is drawn, he reveals something the films haven't quite shown us before. He's not just brutal, he's intelligent. And intelligent enemies are the ones that kill heroes. The five-person strike team arrives at Ravenhill and immediately splits, which, in hindsight, is the first disaster. Thorin sends Fili and Kili to clear the lower levels, while he and Dwalin press toward Azog's position with Bilbo watching their flank. It's a tactically reasonable decision. It's also the decision that costs Thorin everything he loves, though he doesn't know it yet. Fili dies first. There's no dramatic buildup, no last words, no extended farewell sequence, no slow-motion poetry. Azog simply appears behind him, holds him up for Thorin to see across the distance, and then, while Thorin watches, unable to reach him in time, unable to do anything at all, drops him. Dean O'Gorman doesn't get a death scene. His character gets an execution. And that specific brutal distinction is the film making a statement about what war actually is versus what we narratively prefer it to be. Fili doesn't get a hero's death. He gets an orc's calculation, a message sent in the most savage language available. The sound Thorin makes, and Richard Armitage does something here with sound, with the quality of breathing and the architecture of a scream that doesn't fully emerge, is one of the rawer things in the film. It's not cinematic grief, it's animal grief, the kind that doesn't know what to do with itself. And then Azog retreats further into the fortress and Thorin has to follow, because stopping now means Fili died for nothing, and that particular logic, the one that keeps soldiers moving toward the thing that's killing them, is one of war's oldest and most merciless mechanisms. Kili's death, happening simultaneously on the lower levels, is constructed entirely differently. And the contrast is deliberate. Where Fili's death is brutal and sudden and stripped of sentimentality, Kili's death is operatic, not in a self-indulgent way, but in the sense that it's given the full emotional register it earned across three films. He dies protecting Tauriel from Bolg. He dies mid-conversation, essentially. The two of them have just shared the film's most tender exchange, Tauriel telling him she loves him in Elvish, Kili responding with a wonder that Aidan Turner plays so openly and completely that it's almost unbearable to watch knowing what comes next. His death isn't spectacular. He doesn't take out a dozen enemies on his way down. He just dies quickly because war doesn't honor romantic timing, and then Tauriel holds him. Evangeline. Lily's performance in this scene has been unfairly overlooked in most critical retrospectives of the film, perhaps because Tauriel herself was such a controversial addition, a character who doesn't exist in Tolkien's text, inserted to provide both a feminine presence and a romantic subplot. Whether you accept those creative decisions or not, What Lily does in the aftermath of Killy's death is simply extraordinary acting. The grief she plays is completely unguarded. It's not the composed, otherworldly mourning you might expect from an elf. It's messy and immediate and deeply, recognizably human. When Thranduil arrives, when his cold composure meets her raw devastation, and she asks him how he endured the loss of someone he loved, and he says simply that he doesn't remember, Pace and Lily create something between them that elevates both their characters in a single exchange. Thranduil's detachment isn't cruelty in that moment. It's the answer of a man who survived grief by amputating it, and Toriel is watching, in real time, what she might have to become. It's a 2-minute scene in the middle of a war movie. It contains more genuine emotional intelligence than most films manage in 2 hours. Above all of this, on the ice, Thorin has found Azog. The final confrontation between Thorin Oakenshield and the Pale Orc, the one that's been telegraphed since the first Hobbit film, the one built on the history of Azog killing Thorin's grandfather Thror and Thorin's subsequent failure to avenge him, is staged with a stark visual simplicity that feels absolutely right. No armies around them. No spectacle. A frozen lake, flat and white, the sky pressing down gray and cold. 2 figures who have been circling this moment for the entire trilogy, finally in the same space with nothing between them. Jackson and cinematographer Andrew Lesnie make a crucial choice here. They shoot the fight clean. No shaky cam, no rapid cut editing designed to disguise stunt work. You see the choreography? You see the geography of the lake. You see every decision both combatants make. It's a throwback to classical action filmmaking, the kind that trusts its audience to follow spatial logic without being overwhelmed by it. And it works magnificently. The ice cracking under their weight becomes a secondary antagonist, the ground itself becoming unreliable in a fight where both participants are already pushing their physical limits. Thorin goes down, takes a wound that, in any honest accounting, should have ended the fight then and there. And then, through what the film frames as the purest expression of willpower, the last distillation of everything Thorin Oakenshield is, when the goal fever is gone and what's left is just a king who made a promise, he gets back up. The moment he pulls Azog beneath the ice is filmed underwater in a shot of genuinely arresting visual beauty, the Pale Orc floating still in dark water, Thorin's blade through him, and above them, both, the fractured ice ceiling filtering cold light down in broken shafts. It's an image that feels earned and elegiac simultaneously. The death of something that has haunted the story since before the story began. And then Thorin pulls himself back onto the ice and stands, and Bilbo finds him there. This is the center of everything, the axis on which the entire trilogy turns. Thorin dying is not a surprise, not for anyone who read the book, and not really for anyone who has paid attention to the film's careful emotional geometry. His arc has been structured, from the first frame of the first Hobbit film, around the question of whether a person can reclaim something lost without losing themselves in the reclaiming. The dragon sickness was the film's answer. You can reclaim the kingdom, and you can survive the battle, but the cost of having wanted it so completely for so long is that the wanting itself hollows you out. What remains is either nobility or nothing. Thorin gets nobility. Barely, at the last possible moment. Richard Armitage plays the death scene lying in snow, voice dropping, the elaborate dwarven king's armor suddenly looking like it belongs to someone from a long time ago. He talks to Bilbo the way you talk to someone when the pretense is gone, directly, without the performance of strength or dignity. He tells the Hobbit that he was right. He uses Bilbo's name, which he hasn't done in a long time, and he says goodbye in the way that people who have never been good at emotional openness sometimes manage at the very end, clumsily, earnestly, with the specific regret of someone who sees, too late, what they had. Martin Freeman doesn't have many words in this scene. He doesn't need them. His face does the work, the refusal to believe it's happening colliding with the knowledge that it is, the love and the grief arriving together in that particular combination that doesn't have a clean name in any language. He holds Thorin's hand. He doesn't look away. And when it's over, when the stillness settles, he just stays there for a moment, in the snow, on a frozen lake at the edge of a mountain that has cost everyone involved more than they planned to pay. The battle below has turned. The Eagles arrived, as they always do, late and transformative, sweeping the Orc army back with the casual authority of creatures who are enormous and ancient and not particularly burdened by the geopolitical complexities of the situation. Bjorn arrived too, in bear form, because Peter Jackson understood that you cannot have a character that transforms into a bear and then not use that at the climax. The Orc armies break. The valley begins to go quiet. The 5 armies that came to fight over a mountain end up standing together in the wreckage of what the mountain cost. Bilbo's farewell to the company, to Balin, Dwalin, Bombur, Bofur, all the surviving dwarves, who have been his companions and his family for the length of this impossible journey, is played soft, almost casual, in the way that people sometimes keep partings. Casual because the real weight of them is too large to hold in a public moment. Ken Stott's Balin, who has been the company's warmth and wisdom across 3 films, and whom we know from Lord of the Rings, will eventually lead an ill-fated expedition back into Moria and never come out. Says goodbye to Bilbo with a gentleness that carries the additional weight of a future the audience knows about, and these characters don't. It lands differently if you've seen the whole saga. It lands like a door closing. Gandalf walks with Bilbo down from the mountain, and here, in the long walk that takes them from the battlefield back toward the Shire, the film does something that the first 2 Hobbit films were never quite able to do. It breathes. The pace slows. The score quiets. And the conversation between Ian McKellen's Gandalf and Martin Freeman's Bilbo becomes a kind of mutual taking stock. 2 people examining what has been lost and what has been changed, and what, against the odds, has been found. Gandalf's observation that he is glad Bilbo shared in the adventure, that most who do so come to see their world is not so small and dull after all. Rephrased, for this film, from the more famous version that appears at the end of Tolkien's text, lands with the accumulated weight of everything they've been through. It's not a triumphant observation, it's a tired one. And its tiredness is exactly right, because real adventures don't end in triumph. They end in aftermath. They end in the strange flatness of returning to ordinary life, having seen things that ordinary life has no frame for. Bilbo arrives home at Bag End to find his belongings being auctioned off, a genuinely funny sequence, beautifully timed, in which his neighbors have assumed his death and redistributed his property with the brisk practicality of hobbits who have rent due and no patience for dramatic returns. It's comic relief, yes, but it's also something more than that. It's the film's way of pointing out that the world Bilbo left behind didn't stop while he was away saving it. The Shire doesn't know what happened at Erebor, doesn't know about Thorin or the armies or the stone or the dragon, doesn't know that the person walking back through their auction, reclaiming his silver spoons and his chairs, is carrying a weight of experience that will mark him for the rest of his very long life. He finds the Arkenstone box on his mantelpiece, opens it, empty. He gave it away, and the film leaves the significance of that moment unspoken, trusting the audience to feel it. Then he sits down in his armchair, in his hobbit hole, in the exact spot he was sitting in when Gandalf first knocked on his door what seems like a lifetime ago. The last shot of Bilbo in this film, before the scene fades and the film jumps forward 60 years to the aged Bilbo of Fellowship of the Ring opening, is him sitting there in the quiet, not triumphant, not particularly sad, just present. A hobbit who went on an adventure and came back, changed in ways that will take decades to understand. He picks up a letter, looks at it, looks out the window at the Shire. The green, the quiet, the absolutely ordinary beauty of a world that remains intact because enough people in enough dangerous places made enough difficult choices. The window, the light, the green, the end of Middle-earth, or the beginning of it depending on which direction you're reading. Here's something worth sitting with before we get into the characters themselves. Most fantasy films, even very good ones, treat their characters as vehicles. Containers for plot information and emotional cues, designed to move from point A to point B and generate enough audience investment along the way that the climax lands. That's not a criticism, it's a structural reality. Fantasy operates at such enormous scale, involves so many moving pieces, covers so much ground both literally and narratively, that deep psychological interiority is often the first sacrifice made on the altar of runtime management. The Battle of the Five Armies refuses that sacrifice. Not across the board. Some characters here are absolutely vehicles, and we'll be honest about which ones. But at its center, in its 2 protagonists, the film commits to genuine psychological complexity in a way that distinguishes it from almost every other entry in the blockbuster fantasy genre. What Thorin Oakenshield and Bilbo Baggins are doing in this film, and what Richard Armitage and Martin Freeman do with those characters, belongs in a different conversation than the one we usually have about franchise spectacle. It belongs in the conversation about acting, about the specific craft of communicating interior collapse and interior resilience through behavior, through silence, through the physics of a body under pressure. Let's start at the top. Thorin Oakenshield, the king who became the dragon. The academic term for what happens to Thorin in this film is straightforward enough. Dragon sickness, Tolkien's name for the gold madness, induced by proximity to the great treasure of Erebor. The human term is more interesting and more uncomfortable. What Thorin experiences across Battle of the Five Armies is addiction. Specifically, It's the psychological architecture of a person in late-stage addiction to something that was also their life's defining purpose, which makes it categorically harder to recognize and categorically harder to escape than straightforward substance dependency. He didn't choose to want the gold excessively. The gold chose him. Or rather, the centuries of deprivation and exile and cultural trauma that preceded the gold created a person for whom the gold could never be just gold. It had to be everything. Identity, inheritance, justice, proof. Richard Armitage has spoken in interviews about the research he did into addiction and obsessive psychological states to prepare for this performance, and it shows in ways that most viewers probably register emotionally without consciously identifying analytically. The behaviors he plays in the early Erebor sequences, the hypervigilance, the possessiveness, the sudden flares of disproportionate suspicion, are recognizable from clinical descriptions of paranoid ideation. He's not playing a character who went a bit mad. He's playing a specific and coherent psychological deterioration with a specific cause, following a specific internal logic. Watch the way Armitage holds his body in the early scenes inside Erebor. In the first two Hobbit films, Thorin carries himself with a kind of compressed authority, always slightly contained, always managing the space between his dignity and his vulnerability, always working to project more certainty than he actually feels. It's the carriage of a leader in exile. A king without a kingdom, holding himself as if the kingdom is always about to be returned. In 5 Armies, that physical discipline fractures, not dramatically, not all at once, gradually in ways that accumulate. The jaw is tighter, the gaze moves more. The pauses before responses lengthen, in a way that isn't thoughtfulness but calculation, constant internal calculation about who in the room is trustworthy and what information they might be concealing. The moment this becomes fully visible, and it's worth finding in your own rewatch, is the scene where Thorin interrogates his company about the missing Arkenstone. He doesn't shout. He barely raises his voice. But the quality of his attention in that scene is terrifying in a specific way. The attention of someone who has already decided that someone in the room is guilty and is simply deciding, methodically, who. It's the psychology of persecution made physically present. Armitage gives Thorin the eyes of a man who has confused vigilance with accusation and doesn't know it yet. What makes this arc so specifically affecting, and what separates it from simpler villain turn narratives, is that Thorin never stops being sympathetic. Even at his worst, even when he's holding Bilbo over a parapet, even when he's demanding that his company stand armed at the mountain gates against people with legitimate grievances, you understand him. You understand where this came from. The history is so deeply embedded in the character, drawn across all 3 films with such consistent specificity. The fall of Erebor, the decades of wandering, the weight of being the last king of a diminished people, that his madness never reads as corruption. It reads as the inevitable consequence of asking one person to carry that much for that long without breaking. The scene at the parapet is the apex of this, and it deserves more analysis than it usually receives. Thorin grabbing Bilbo is, on its surface, the most dramatically legible moment of the dragon sickness. Physical violence against an ally, against the most beloved member of his company, the clearest possible sign of how far gone he is. But Armitage plays something more complicated than simple rage. What's underneath the fury in that scene, visible in brief flickers between the aggression, is horror. Thorin is frightened of himself. He knows, on some level, that the sickness hasn't fully smothered, that what he's doing is wrong. He does it anyway, and that simultaneous awareness and inability to stop is the most precise rendering of what psychological compulsion actually feels like from the inside. The redemption arc, the vision of drowning in gold, the breaking point, the emergence from Erebor in armor with clear eyes, is earned precisely because the fall was so carefully and honestly constructed. It doesn't feel like a narrative reset. It feels like a person clawing their way back from somewhere very far away, and Armitage plays the aftermath. The quieter Thorin who leads the charge to Ravenhill, who knows what he's doing and why and what it might cost, with a completeness that makes the death scene devastating rather than simply sad. The tragedy of Thorin Oakenshield isn't that he was corrupted, it's that he was restored just in time to lose everything the restoration was for. That's a genuinely Shakespearean arc, and Richard Armitage executes it in a franchise blockbuster without a single false note. Bilbo Baggins, the bravest coward in Middle-earth. Martin Freeman is doing something slightly different, and arguably even more technically demanding. Because the psychological complexity he's working with is entirely internal and almost entirely unspoken. Bilbo Baggins, as written in Tolkien's novel, is fundamentally a comic figure who discovers unexpected courage. He's charming, resourceful, occasionally accidental in his heroism, and essentially optimistic throughout. Freeman's Bilbo in the films carries all of that: the warmth, the practicality, the relatable scale of a person who wanted nothing more than his armchair and his tea and found himself on the wrong end of a dragon's attention. But Freeman adds layers that the source text doesn't fully contain, and Battle of the Five Armies is where those layers matter most. The film's Bilbo is a person in constant negotiation between what he knows and what he can afford to do about it. He's known since before the events of this film that Thorin is deteriorating. He's known that the Arkenstone is dangerous in Thorin's hands. He's known, in the quiet, practical way that hobbits know things, that the quest he signed up for has become something that none of the original contract language covered, and he's been sitting with that knowledge, carrying it, trying to figure out when the cost of acting becomes less than the cost of continuing to wait. That internal calculation is what Freeman plays in every scene he has in the first half of this film. Watch his eyes when Thorin speaks to him. Watch the slight delays before Bilbo responds to questions about the treasure, the way his body orients itself slightly away from conversations about the Arkenstone, the quality of attention he gives. Thorin that is simultaneously loving and clinical, the attention of someone performing ongoing triage on a person they care about. It's one of the finest sustained performances in the film, and probably the least remarked upon precisely because it's so understated. Freeman never announces what Bilbo is doing. He just does it, quietly, continuously, in the background of scenes that are nominally about other things. The decision to take the Arkenstone to the enemy camp is the film's great moral fulcrum, and its greatness lies in the fact that it's genuinely arguable. You can construct a solid case that Bilbo was right. You can construct an equally solid case that he was wrong, that taking property that wasn't his and using it against its rightful owner, regardless of motivation, is a betrayal that cannot be fully redeemed by good intentions. The film doesn't resolve this argument. It presents it and lets it sit, which is much braver dramatically than giving the audience a clean verdict. What Freeman communicates in the scenes where Bilbo is carrying the Arkenstone secretly is the weight of moral ambiguity in a person who isn't philosophically equipped for it. Bilbo isn't a political thinker. He doesn't have a framework for thinking through the ethics of whistleblowing, or the ethics of protective deception, or the ethics of unilateral action taken to prevent a harm that hasn't happened yet. He's a hobbit from the Shire who bakes seed cakes and reads old maps for fun. He's figuring out ethics in real time, under pressure, without guidance, while the person he's trying to protect is getting harder to reach by the hour. The courage this requires is a completely different register from physical courage. It's harder in many ways. Physical courage has a clear shape. Face the monster, survive, or don't. The courage to act against someone you love for their benefit, knowing they'll see it as betrayal, knowing the outcome is uncertain, that has no clear shape. It just hurts. And Freeman plays the specific quality of that kind of courage with exquisite precision. Bilbo doesn't look brave when he walks into the enemy camp. He looks scared and determined and slightly sick and entirely certain that there is no better option, which is exactly right. The final scenes with Bilbo, the farewell to the company, the long walk back, the return to Bag End, complete a character arc that spans 3 films and builds to something that most blockbuster franchises never bother to aim for: genuine wisdom. Not the performed wisdom of a character who delivers a speech about what they've learned. Quiet, costly, unannounced wisdom of someone who has been changed by suffering and chosen not to be diminished by it. Bilbo returns to the Shire carrying losses that can't be undone. Thorin, Keely, the version of himself that existed before the journey, and what Freeman does with the final sequence is hold all of that without collapsing under it. Sitting in the armchair, looking out the window, present. That's what wisdom looks like actually, not the speech. The stillness after. Branduil, the king who survived. By forgetting Lee Pace's Elven King is one of the great pleasures of the Hobbit trilogy, and Five Armies finally reveals the depth underneath the imperious surface that the previous films established. Thranduil's defining characteristic, the one that makes him interesting rather than simply impressive, is the dissociation between his external performance of composure and the actual emotional wreckage underneath it. Lee Pace plays him in a specific key across the trilogy, a kind of absolute, almost inhuman stillness, the bearing of someone for whom dignity is not a choice, but a survival strategy. He is never ruffled, never raised. Everything Thranduil does, including going to war, is done with the affect of someone extremely bored by the inadequacy of the universe around him. And then Tauriel asks him how he survived losing someone he loved, and for one brief, precisely controlled moment, Lee Pace lets that armor crack, not dramatically. A single flicker, a fractional shift in the quality of stillness, a brief and genuine wound visible behind the composure. He says he doesn't remember. And the devastating implication that he survived by excising the memory, by burying the grief so completely that the love went with it, reframes everything we've seen of Thranduil across 3 films in an instant. His obsession with the white gems, his coldness toward his son Legolas, his absolute unwillingness to risk his people for others' causes. All of it now reads as the behavior of a person who, having experienced catastrophic grief once, has organized his entire existence around ensuring he will never experience it again. He keeps his people safe because he cannot survive losing them. He keeps his son at arm's length because closeness is a vulnerability he won't allow himself. He wants the gems because they were hers, whoever she was, and having them back is the closest thing to having her back that an immortal king who has survived his wife's death by centuries can manage. None of this is stated explicitly in the film. It doesn't need to be. Pace puts it in the performance and trusts the audience to find it. That's the work. Bard, the weight of leadership. Nobody asked for Bard. The Bowman is a fascinating character study in the specific psychology of reluctant leadership, and Luke Evans plays him with a consistency and a groundedness that the role absolutely requires. Every leadership choice Bard makes in this film costs him something. Killing Smaug costs him the safety of anonymity. Suddenly, he's a hero, and heroes get things expected of them. Organizing Lake Town survivors into Dale costs him the exhaustion of someone who hasn't slept and can't stop. Going to the mountain to negotiate costs him the certain knowledge that he might be walking into a hostage situation with his children watching. His arc isn't about a person discovering that they're a born leader and growing into it. It's about a person who already knew they were capable of leadership and spent years actively avoiding it, being proved right that leadership is as difficult and costly as he suspected. What Evans brings to this, and it's a performance achievement worth naming directly, is a total absence of grandiosity. In a film full of kings and wizards and warriors who carry themselves with the weight of legend, Bard just looks like a tired man doing the right thing because nobody else is in the right position to do it. The scene where he rides out to face the entire Erebor standoff with the Arkenstone in his hand, no armor, no army at his back at that moment, just a bowman walking up to a fortified mountain to have an honest conversation. That's an act of extraordinary courage that Evans plays with the specific flatness of someone who has decided not to think too carefully about the odds. Because thinking about the odds would stop him, and stopping is not an option. Tauriel and Keeley, the argument for invention. The Tauriel problem has been debated at length since her introduction, and the debate is usually framed around fidelity to source material. She doesn't exist in Tolkien, therefore she shouldn't exist in the film. Therefore, everything associated with her is a distraction. This framing deserves pushback. Cinema adaptation is an act of translation, not transcription. The question isn't whether Tauriel exists in Tolkien. The question is whether she serves the film's purposes effectively. And in Battle of the Five Armies, having made the creative decision to keep her across 3 films, the answer is yes. Specifically in the grief function she serves in Keeley's death sequence, which we examined in the story section, but also in the larger thematic function of representing connection across the fracture lines that the film keeps drawing between its factions. Tauriel is an elf who loves a dwarf. In the world of Middle-earth, that's not just a romantic complication. It's a statement about the possibility of bridging a divide that has existed for thousands of years, and that the current political situation is actively deepening. Her love for Keeley is the film's most direct argument against the logic of armies, against the idea that people are reducible to their faction's historical grievances, and her grief after his death is the film's most visceral cost. Not the bodies in the battle, not the statistics. One person holding another person who is gone. That specificity is what grief actually is, and Evangeline Lilly earns it fully. Aidan Turner's Keeley, for his part, is a performance of pure, unguarded warmth, open and genuine, and exactly what the film needs in that relationship, because if the love weren't completely convincing, the grief wouldn't land. Turner makes it convincing. The wonder he plays in his final exchange with Tauriel, the amazement that an elf could feel this way about a dwarf, the almost incredulous joy of it, is heartbreaking precisely because it's so completely present tense. He's not worried about the battle. He's not preparing for anything. He's just there, in that moment, happy. The suddenness of his death immediately after is not cheap manipulation. It's accurate. That's how fast it happens. That's exactly how fast. Gandalf, the knowing weight. Ian McKellen. Gandalf in Battle of the Five Armies is operating in a different register from the wizard's earlier appearances in the trilogy, and it's worth identifying specifically what's changed and why. In An Unexpected Journey and The Desolation of Smaug, Gandalf is largely the architect, the one who sets things in motion, who sees further than others, who manages the narrative from a position of relative, if not total, authority. In this film, that authority is diminished, and McKellen plays the diminishment with honesty. Gandalf has just been defeated at Dol Guldur. He had to be rescued. The darkness he's been warning everyone about, the one that's been dismissed and minimized across multiple films by multiple parties who had their own problems, has proved itself catastrophically real, and nobody is fully listening yet. The quiet urgency McKellen plays in this film, the desperation underneath the composure, the aging around the edges of a character who is supposed to be beyond aging, makes Gandalf more human in Five Armies than at perhaps any other point in either trilogy. He's tired. He's been right about things that he wished he'd been wrong about. He knows that the darkness ended at Dol Guldur for now, but not forever, and that the battle at Erebor, enormous as it is a skirmish in a much longer war. He holds all of this and can't quite put it down. And the scene where he says goodbye to Bilbo, where he admits, with genuine feeling, his gladness at their shared adventure, is the most emotionally accessible McKellen has been as this character in 6 films, precisely because it's the first time Gandalf allows himself to be simply glad rather than purposeful. The Dwarven Company earned brotherhood. There are 13 dwarves in Thorin's company, and Battle of the Five Armies doesn't pretend to give all of them full arcs. Several remain largely visual. Bombur, Ori, Nori, present and distinguished in design but not individuated in story. That's honest filmmaking. Not every ensemble member can carry equal dramatic weight, and pretending otherwise would require either a 6-hour film or a very different script. What the film does superbly is maintain the collective texture of the company, the brotherhood of it, the specific quality of a group of people who have been through impossible things together and now understand each other in the particular way that shared extreme experience creates. The scenes where the company watches Thorin's disintegration, the careful glances between Balin and Dwalin, the way Beaufort positions himself slightly between Thorin and the others during tense moments, the expressions of people trying to calculate whether they're watching a king or a danger, communicate the internal life of the group without requiring individual exposition. Ken Stott's Balin deserves particular mention as the company's emotional anchor. He functions, in some ways, as the audience's surrogate in the Erebor sequences, the most thoughtful observer of Thorin's decline, the most articulate about what's being lost, the one who grieves the king's illness while still serving the king. His brief moments with Bilbo carry enormous weight precisely because he understands, as few others in the company do, the full significance of what Bilbo is attempting with the Arkenstone. He doesn't say so. He doesn't need to. Stott communicates it in the quality of the look he gives Freeman, sadness and respect, and the resigned wisdom of someone who has watched history move toward a consequence they couldn't prevent. Knowing what we know from Lord of the Rings, that Balin will eventually lead an ill-fated expedition to reclaim Moria and die there, his tomb discovered by Frodo's fellowship in the darkness of Khazad-dûm, his goodbye to Bilbo in the aftermath of the battle carries a particular ache that is unique to the experience of watching these films in their full context. He survived Erebor. He survived the Battle of Five Armies. He said goodbye warmly to a small friend on a cold morning and then went back to being a dwarf in Middle-earth. And later, not too much later, in the grand scale of things, he didn't come back from a mountain. Some goodbyes, the films understand, are goodbyes to more than just the person walking away. Azog. What a villain should be finally. And briefly, because Azog is not the film's thematic center but is essential to its dramatic architecture. Manu Bennett's Pale Orc deserves recognition for what the character accomplishes that pure monster villains rarely do. Azog works because he's not mindless. The tunnel ambush at the battle isn't the act of a creature. It's the act of a tactician, someone who surveyed the terrain, understood the opponent's formation, identified the optimal moment of disruption, and executed a plan with cold precision. When Azog lures Thorin to Ravenhill, he's not simply drawing him out. He's diagnosing Thorin's psychology correctly, knowing that a newly restored king, freshly broken from the dragon sickness, would respond to the opportunity to end the threat personally. He knows Thorin. He understands what the call to honorable combat means to this specific dwarf, and he uses that understanding to set a trap. That intelligence makes the confrontation on the frozen lake genuinely earned rather than simply physically spectacular. Two capable, experienced, mutually aware opponents, one with centuries of warfare behind him, one with the specific unbreakable quality of a king with nothing left to lose, meeting in the place that was always going to be the end. The ice is appropriate in its way. What it contains below the surface is greater than what's visible, which, for both of them, has always been true. The characters in Battle of the Five Armies are, collectively, the argument for taking this film more seriously than its critical reception generally encouraged. The spectacle is real and impressive. The craft is genuinely excellent in places. But the reason this film lingers, the reason people who saw it in 2014 still feel the specific sadness of Thorin's death, still feel the weight of Bilbo sitting alone in Bag End, is the people in it. The specific, carefully constructed, honestly performed people. Cinema can build you a dragon. Any sufficiently funded studio can do that now. What it can't automate, what it can't generate algorithmically, is the thing Martin Freeman does with his face when Thorin is dying in the snow. That's irreplaceable, and it's why this film, for all its imperfections, is worth every word we spend on it. Let's talk about what it actually takes to build a war. Not the concept of it, not the story reasons for it, but the physical, logistical, craft-level reality of putting 30,000 digital combatants into a valley, making them feel individual and weighted and dangerous, and then cutting between them and two specific faces in close-up without the audience ever losing the thread of either the macro-geography or the micro-emotion. That's what the Battle of the Five Armies asks of its technical department. All of them, simultaneously. And the degree to which it succeeds, which is higher than the critical conversation around the film usually acknowledges, is a story about craftsmanship at a scale that the film industry doesn't attempt very often. Start with the image itself, because the image is where everything begins. Andrew Lesnie and the question of 4.8 FPS. Andrew Lesnie shot all 6 of Peter Jackson's Middle-earth films. He won the Academy Award for Cinematography for The Fellowship of the Ring in 2002, and the visual grammar he developed across those first 3 films, the specific quality of light in the Shire, the cold blue of Mordor, the golden warmth of Rivendell, became so thoroughly associated with Middle-earth in the popular imagination that it's now essentially impossible to think of Tolkien's world without thinking of Lesnie's rendering of it. He died in April 2015, 4 months after Battle of the Five Armies was released. The Hobbit trilogy was his final work, and it deserves to be discussed on its own terms, rather than simply measured against what came before. The 48 frames per second format, high frame rate, or HFR, is where most discussions of the Hobbit trilogy's visual identity begin and where most of them stall out. The standard argument is familiar. 4.8 FPS makes everything look too real, too immediate, too much like a soap opera or a behind-the-scenes documentary. It strips away the dreamlike quality that 24F cinema has trained audiences to associate with immersive storytelling. It makes the sets look like sets, and the costumes look like costumes, and the prosthetics look like rubber. Some of this critique is fair. The format is genuinely unflattering to certain kinds of footage, particularly mid-range shots of people in elaborate makeup, which is, admittedly, a significant percentage of what the Hobbit films contain. But the wholesale rejection of HFR as a failed experiment misses something important about what Lesnie does with the format in specific contexts across Battle of the Five Armies. The Smaug attack on Lake Town is the clearest example. Shot at 48 FPS, the sequence has a tactile quality, flame, water, falling timber, the physical chaos of a dragon destroying an inhabited structure that traditional frame rates would have softened into something more palatably cinematic. HFR refuses that softening. The fire looks hot, the water looks cold. The destruction looks like actual destruction rather than photographed destruction, and the effect is disorientation in the best possible sense. You cannot aestheticize your way into comfortable distance from what's happening, because the format won't let you. That's not a failure of the technology. That's the technology working exactly as intended for this specific purpose. Similarly, the frozen lake confrontation between Thorin and Azog, the one we discussed in the story section for its dramatic staging, benefits enormously from HFR in ways that become apparent when you compare it to traditionally shot action sequences of comparable scale. Every step on the ice is visible in its full instability. The physical reality of 2 large beings fighting on a surface designed to fracture under weight is communicated not just through sound design, but through the hyper-real visual information that 4.8 FPS provides. You don't need a character to announce that the ice is unreliable. You can see it. The format performs the environmental storytelling. Lesnie's lighting choices across the film's 3 primary environments, Erebor, Dale, and the Valley Battleground, are worth examining individually because each space is given a distinct visual identity that reflects its dramatic function. Erebor is lit in deep golds and shadows that should feel warm but don't. The treasure produces light that ought to be inviting and instead feels smothering. Lesnie achieves this through a specific color temperature that sits just slightly on the wrong side of comfortable, warm enough to suggest abundance, heavy enough to suggest entrapment. The corridors are always either too bright, the gold reflecting everywhere, inescapably, or too dark, the shadows of vast spaces that dwarf any individual figure standing in them. Thorin is almost never shot in balanced light inside Erebor. He's either overlit by the gold or standing at the edge of darkness, which is precisely where his psychology lives across the film's first half. Dale is the inverse. Lesnie shoots the abandoned city in a flat gray light that reads as emptiness rather than gloom, not threatening, just absent, a place where the color has been taken out. The refugee scenes in Dale have a documentary texture that contrasts sharply with the heightened visual grammar of Erebor, And that contrast is purposeful. These are real people in real crisis, and their reality needs to register differently from the mythological scale of what's happening inside the mountain. The Bally battlefield is both shifting between the two registers as the emotional stakes shift, sometimes cutting from the gray human scale of men fighting for survival to the golden sky behind the eagles arriving at speed, the color temperature changing as the tide of the battle changes. It's subtle color grading work that operates below conscious recognition for most viewers, but shapes the emotional experience of the sequence profoundly. Weta Digital, The Army, Behind the Army, Richard Taylor, and the teams at Weta Workshop and Weta Digital built Middle-earth. All of it. From the handcrafted armor of each individual dwarf warrior to the digital simulations of 30,000 orc combatants flooding a valley, the scale of what the Weta organizations contributed to the Hobbit trilogy is staggering even by the standards of contemporary blockbuster production. In Battle of the Five Armies, Weta's most visible contribution is obviously the battle itself. But what distinguishes the battle's visual execution from generic, large-scale action filmmaking isn't the scale. Plenty of films have matched or exceeded the quantity of digital combatants. It's the behavior. The orcs in the tunnel emergence sequence don't move like a crowd simulation. They move like individuals, diverging, adapting, responding to specific obstacles in ways that generate the visual noise of actual chaotic combat rather than the clean wave patterns of computer-generated mass movement. This comes from the massive software system that Weta developed originally for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, now significantly evolved, that gives each digital agent a behavioral rule set complex enough to generate emergent movement patterns that no animator designed individually. The result is that wide shots of the battle have a visual density that rewards close attention. There are stories happening in the background that the camera never follows, combatants making choices you can read in their body language, moments of individual action embedded in collective movement. Whether the average viewer registers this consciously or not, it contributes enormously to the felt reality of the sequence. The battle doesn't look like a display. It looks like a catastrophe. Smaug, who, technically, dies in the first 10 minutes, represents a different category of Weta achievement. The dragon was built across all 3 Hobbit films as a progressive technical achievement. Each film's version an improvement on the last, and the final iteration in 5 Armies is the fullest realization of what the team was attempting. The skin deformation as he moves, the interaction of his wingspan with air and smoke, and the thermal columns rising from his own fire, the specific amber intelligence of his eyes. These details accumulate into something that doesn't read as animation. It reads as biology, as a creature with a body that has weight and a face that has will. Smaug's death sequence, the asymmetry of a creature, this vast and this powerful, simply falling, the lack of ceremony in the transition from threat to corpse, the way the body displaces water in the lake in a physically accurate ripple pattern, is one of Weta Digital's finest sustained sequences, and the fact that it precedes the title card means it's easily overlooked in retrospective analysis. It deserves not to be. The White Council sequence at Dol Guldur, which we've mentioned briefly in the story sections but haven't examined technically, is worth pausing on here because it represents a genuinely unusual visual problem. The film needs to show Galadriel confronting something that is, essentially, evil as an abstract metaphysical concept. Not a creature, not an army, a presence, a darkness with intention. The visual solution Weta arrives at, working from Jackson's direction, is to render the necromancer as Sauron as a figure constructed from shadow and fire that is simultaneously recognizable as humanoid and categorically wrong in its proportions and physics. It doesn't move the way things move. It doesn't occupy space the way things occupy space. The visual incorrectness is the point. This is something that exists outside the rules that govern visible reality, and the effects work makes that legible without over-explaining it. Cate Blanchett's Galadriel in this sequence is partially a performance and partially a composite. Blanchett's face rendered through digital processing into the terrifying, dark Galadriel form that Tolkien describes in the Fellowship sequence, and that the Lord of the Rings films famously pulled back from showing fully. Here, for the first time, Jackson commits to it. And the result is the most visually startling 2 minutes in the film. A combination of performance, digital effects, and sound design that puts the viewer somewhere genuinely uncomfortable and doesn't offer a quick exit. He didn't just write music for these movies. He built a musical world with the same level of structural intentionality that Tolkien brought to the linguistic world of Middle-earth. Themes and counter-themes, leitmotifs for characters and cultures and ideas, a system of musical relationships that evolved and transformed across more than 12 hours of runtime. The Battle of the Five Armies represents the end of that system, and Shore is acutely aware of it. The score operates on two levels simultaneously throughout the film. On the surface level, it does exactly what blockbuster scores are supposed to do. It amplifies action, it underscores emotion, it provides the musical architecture that helps audiences navigate the tonal shifts between comedy and tragedy, between spectacle and intimacy, that a film this tonal complex requires. On the deeper level, it performs a quiet act of musical archaeology, returning to themes from across all 6 films and presenting them in their final form, not as triumphant restatements but as something closer to recollection, things that happened, that mattered, that are now passing. The Dwarven themes, Thorin's people's music, the specific modal quality that Shore uses to represent Dwarven culture across all 3 Hobbit films, are the most emotionally active element of the score. In the early Erebor sequences, these themes are present but distorted, harmonically wrong, in ways that are subtle enough that you might not consciously notice but that register as unease. Thorin's theme, when it appears in the scenes of his dragon sickness, is shifted into a minor key and played in a lower register than its original statement. It sounds like Thorin, but wrong. Like a recording made at the wrong speed. It's extraordinary musical characterization, and is doing narrative work that the dialogue doesn't need to do because Shore has already done it. The moment Thorin breaks from the gold vision and decides to go to war, the Dwarven themes resolve. They don't return to their original major key form. The film is too honest for that, too aware that Thorin is going to war and not coming back. But they resolve into something clear and purposeful, which is the musical equivalent of Armitage's performance in that moment. Thorin is himself again. Not saved, just himself, and Shore's score marks that transition with a precision that would be impossible to achieve with dialogue or visual storytelling alone. The Song of the Lonely Mountain, the signature Dwarven anthem that runs through all 3 Hobbit films in various forms, originally performed by Richard Armitage himself in An Unexpected Journey, appears in 5 Armies in its most emotionally stripped-down form. No grandeur, no ensemble, no triumphant rendering. It appears quietly, in the aftermath, during the farewell sequences, as a thread of melody that's almost too small to hear, a song becoming a memory. That's what Shore does with it. He turns the grandest musical statement of the entire trilogy into something you have to lean in to catch, which is exactly what it feels like when the things that defined a chapter of your life begin to recede. The Misty Mountains callback in the film's final sequence, when Bilbo is walking home, when the camera pulls back from the Shire, is the closing statement of Shore's entire 6-film work. It's a theme that began in An Unexpected Journey as a Dwarven lament, a song of longing for a lost home, and here it returns transformed. No longer a lament because the home has been found and the longing resolved, but carrying the bittersweet quality of something that has been completed. The past tense of an emotion you used to have very intensely. That's an extraordinarily difficult musical effect to achieve. Shore achieves it. Dan Henna and production design, Building Consequence, production designer Dan Henna, working with Alan Lee and John Howe, whose conceptual illustrations have been the visual grammar of Tolkien adaptations since the 1970s, faced a specific challenge in Battle of the 5 Armies that the previous Hobbit films didn't pose in quite the same way. The challenge was ruin. The previous films were primarily concerned with building impressive things, Erebor's grandeur, Rivendell's elegance, the visual density of Lake Town's floating architecture. This film is primarily concerned with destroying them. Dale, the great city that once sat thriving in Erebor's shadow, needs to look like a place where civilization was interrupted mid-sentence 60 years ago and never resumed. The production design team built Dale as organized absence, doorways that still hold their frames, streets that still have their paving stones, architecture that remembers its purpose without being able to fulfill it. The details are what make it work. A market stall with rotted goods still on the shelf, a fountain dry but structurally intact, child-sized furniture visible through a broken window. Someone lived here. Someone specific and particular. The war took them midlife and left the furniture. Erebor's interior design faces the opposite problem. It needs to feel simultaneously magnificent and wrong. A space that is objectively extraordinary and subjectively poisonous, beautiful enough that you understand why someone would lose their mind over it, and suffocating enough that you feel the loss of perspective that the beauty produces. The production team achieves this through scale. Erebor's halls are not human-scaled. They're not even dwarf-scaled, not really. They're sized for myth, for the accumulated weight of Dwarven civilization at its absolute peak, which means that any individual figure standing in them is dwarfed in a way that communicates vulnerability even when the character is supposed to be powerful. Thorin, walking through his treasure chamber, is visually tiny. The gold swallows him. That's not accidental. Ravenhill, as a design achievement, is the film's most underappreciated set-piece environment. The crumbling watchtower complex that serves as the location for the film's climactic confrontation is constructed from a very specific visual logic. Everything that should provide stability has been compromised. Walkways that should hold weight are cracked. Towers that should provide elevation are half collapsed. The ice covers everything, which makes the visual information about structural integrity even harder to read. You can't tell, from the surface, which surfaces will hold and which won't. This produces a sustained visual anxiety in the fight sequences that is entirely environmental rather than dependent on editing pace. The location itself is frightening. Being in it feels like a mistake, which is exactly the right sensation for a sequence that is, at its core, a trap. Jabez Olson, cutting between worlds, editing a film with 3 simultaneous action lines: the Valley Battle, the Ravenhill confrontation, and the Dol Guldur sequence that runs roughly concurrent with the battle's early stages, is a spatial and temporal problem of genuine complexity. Jabez Olson, who edited all 3 Hobbit films, solves it through a principle that's simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute. He always cuts on emotion rather than action. The temptation in multi-front battle editing is to cut on motion, to match the kinetic energy of one sequence to the kinetic energy of the next, to keep the pace uniform so that no single front feels slower than the other. Olson largely resists this. Instead, he cuts when an emotional beat in one thread creates a question that another thread answers, or when the emotional register of one sequence needs the counterpoint of another to land correctly. The result is that the cross-cutting serves the story's meaning rather than just its momentum. The most striking example of this is the sequence immediately following Fili's death. The film cuts, in the immediate aftermath of Thorin's reaction, to the valley below, to the battle at its most impersonal and enormous, thousands of combatants in motion, the individual subsumed completely in the collective. The contrast is stark and entirely purposeful. Thorin has just experienced the most intimate loss possible, the death of a nephew at arm's length, and the world is proceeding at full industrial scale with complete indifference to that loss. War doesn't pause for grief. The edit makes you feel that truth without stating it. Olson's pacing across the film's first half, the slower, more psychologically concentrated sequences inside Erebor and in the Lake Town aftermath, is equally deliberate, and it's where the editing most often gets criticized. The film's first 40 minutes are not fast. They're not trying to be. The deliberate rhythm of the early sequences is doing 2 things: establishing the weight of what's at stake before the battle begins, so that the battle has emotional consequence rather than just spectacle, and giving Armitage and Freeman the space their performances need to land fully. Cutting faster through those scenes would have generated more conventional blockbuster pacing and gutted everything that makes the film worth watching. The decision to let scenes breathe is a production-level commitment, not just an editor's choice. Jackson, Walsh, and Boyens made it in the writing, Armitage and Freeman made it in the performance, and Olson made it stick in the cutting room. It's a collaborative act of restraint in a film that could easily have spent its entire runtime in motion. That restraint is what gives the motion meaning when it finally arrives. The extended edition, what the theatrical cut, sacrificed a brief but necessary note. The extended edition of Battle of the Five Armies, running approximately 20 additional minutes, restores sequences that materially change the film's texture in several places. Most significantly in the battle itself, where additional footage of the Iron Hills dwarves and the Elbish formations gives the tactical geography of the engagement more clarity than the theatrical cut provides, and in the Dol Guldur sequence, which in its extended form runs longer and gives Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving additional material that deepens the scene's impact. The extended version of Thorin's dragon sickness hallucination, slightly longer than the theatrical cut, is particularly important because it extends the moment just past comfortable, which is precisely where it needs to go. The discomfort of the extended vision communicates something the theatrical version trims before fully arriving at, that the gold madness isn't dramatic or spectacular from the inside. It's seductive. It feels from within it like clarity rather than distortion. That's the most frightening thing about it, and the extended cut makes time for that horror in a way the theatrical cut's pacing doesn't quite allow. For anyone approaching this film seriously, for anyone writing about it or teaching it or thinking carefully about what it is and what it does, the extended cut is the version worth examining. It's not perfect. The additions occasionally confirm why they were trimmed for theatrical release. But the overall effect is of a film more fully itself, more committed to its own ambitions, less in a hurry to reassure audiences that the spectacle is coming. The technical achievement of the Battle of the Five Armies is most accurately understood as a work of coordination rather than virtuosity. No single element, not the photography, not the score, not the effects work, not the editing, is the thing that makes the film work. It's the sustained, demanding, 14-year cumulative collaboration between all of them, all pulling in the same direction, all serving the same story about a king and a hobbit and a mountain full of gold that turned out to cost more than anyone planned to pay. That kind of filmmaking doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen because the budget was large enough. It happens because the people involved cared, genuinely, specifically, stubbornly, about doing it right. And in the craftsmanship of Battle of the Five Armies, at every level, you can see that care. Even when the film falls short of its ambitions, it falls short while reaching for something real. That matters. In an industry increasingly optimized for the adequate, it matters enormously. Fantasy has always been philosophy in disguise. Not the cheap kind, not the allegory, as instruction manual approach where every dragon is explicitly labeled as a stand-in for nuclear weapons or corporate greed or whatever the author wants you to be afraid of this decade. The good kind. The kind where the distance that myth and magic provide allows you to examine human impulses at a remove that makes the examination bearable, where the strangeness of the world permits an honesty about people that realism, with its insistence on social plausibility and psychological documentation, sometimes can't quite reach. Tolkien understood this instinctively. His work is full of ideas wearing the costume of adventure. The Battle of the Five Armies, at its best, honors that understanding, using the scale and spectacle of epic fantasy to make arguments about greed, sacrifice, belonging, and the specific human catastrophe of letting the pursuit of something good become indistinguishable from something destructive. These aren't abstract concepts in the film. They're embodied, dramatized, made specific through character and action and consequence. Let's pull them apart. The geometry of greed. The most obvious thematic engine in Five Armies is the dragon sickness, and the most obvious thing to say about it is that it represents greed, which is true, but incomplete. Stopping at greed misses what makes Thorin's illness such a precise and uncomfortable portrait of a specifically modern psychological condition. Greed, in its simplest form, is wanting more than you need. What Thorin experiences is different. It's the pathological attachment of identity to possession, the belief, operating below the level of conscious thought, that having the gold is the same as being worthy of it, that the mountain's contents are not just wealth but proof that the exile was wrong, proof that the suffering meant something, proof that Thorin Oakenshield is who he has always claimed to be. This is why the Arkenstone specifically drives him to the edge of violence in ways that the general treasure doesn't. The gem isn't more valuable than everything else in the hoard, not materially, but it's the symbol of legitimate kingship, the object that confers meaning rather than just wealth. Without it, all the gold in Erebor is just gold, an enormous quantity of metal that doesn't, by itself, answer the question Thorin has been asking his entire life. Was I right? Did we deserve this? Did our suffering purchase something real? The film understands, with unusual sophistication for its genre, that this form of identity through possession is not a character flaw, unique to dwarves or kings or people in proximity to magical treasure. It's a template, a cognitive architecture that gets activated by sufficient loss and longing. The specific trigger is different for different people. A business, a relationship, a homeland, a version of yourself you remember being before circumstances took it. But the underlying structure is identical. You attach your sense of self to the thing you lost. You pursue its return with escalating desperation. You lose your capacity to see clearly about costs and consequences because the fog of needing generates its own logic, and that logic feels, from inside it, perfectly rational. Tolkien named this specifically in the lore of his world. The Arkenstone was created from the very rock of the mountain, irrevocably connected to Erebor's identity, enchanted in a way that made it both jewel and psychological anchor. The dragon's presence over the treasure for 60 years, a dragon whose entire existence was organized around possessive obsession, has saturated everything in that hoard with something. Not magic exactly, more like orientation. A gravity that pulls susceptible minds toward the same relationship with material things that destroyed the dragon himself, which makes the dragon sickness less a curse than an inheritance. Thorin doesn't catch it. He arrives predisposed to it, his entire life suffering having prepared the exact psychological space that the treasure fills. And that reframing, from moral failing to structural vulnerability, is what gives the film's treatment of his illness its unusual compassion. He's not a warning about bad character. He's a portrait of how good character, subjected to sufficient pressure for sufficient time, finds its breaking point. Sacrifice and its discontents. If greed is the film's diagnosis, sacrifice is its proposed medicine. But Five Armies is careful and quietly brave about not romanticizing that medicine. The film is full of sacrifices. Bilbo sacrifices his relationship with Thorin to save Thorin's life. Thorin sacrifices his safety, and ultimately his life, to protect his people from the consequences of his own poor leadership. Tauriel sacrifices her place among the elves for a love that ends in loss rather than resolution. The eagles sacrifice their neutrality, the dwarves of the Iron Hills sacrifice their safety, and Gandalf, in a quieter way, sacrifices the optimism about the world that has sustained him across all his appearances in the two trilogies. None of these sacrifices are clean. That's the film's most important thematic statement, and the one that most clearly distinguishes it from simpler franchise finales. In cleaner narratives, sacrifice produces reward. You give up something, and the universe, through the mechanics of plot, compensates you. The hero gets the victory. The lovers are united. The people who chose correctly are vindicated. Five Armies doesn't work like that. Bilbo's sacrifice of the Arkenstone prevents war. Just barely, temporarily, in ways that the Azog-directed tunnel assault renders moot almost immediately. The political situation the Arkenstone was meant to resolve gets resolved by violence instead. His sacrifice was still right. It was still worth making. But it didn't work the way he intended, which is the lived experience of most sacrifices that real people make in real situations. You do the brave and costly thing. The outcome is oblique and partial. You live with it anyway. Thorin's sacrifice is the clearest. He recovers himself, chooses correctly, goes to the right war for the right reasons, and dies. Not because he made a mistake on Ravenhill. He made good tactical decisions there under impossible circumstances. He dies because Azog is a formidable opponent and because war has a randomness to it that courage doesn't override. His sacrifice redeems him morally and spiritually and doesn't save him physically, which is the honest version of how redemption works. The narrative doesn't owe him survival in exchange for his soul. The ledger doesn't balance that way. What the film offers instead, and what Tolkien's original text is also reaching for, in its more elliptical way, is the idea that sacrifice matters in its own register, independent of outcome. That choosing correctly at cost changes something essential about who you are, regardless of what it produces in the external world. Thorin dies himself. That's the gift. Not victory, not survival, not vindication. Just dying as himself rather than as the thing the dragon sickness was making him. In the economy of the film's moral universe, that's everything. Home is the axis of everything. The word home appears more often in the Hobbit trilogy than any other single concept, and in Battle of the Five Armies, it achieves the density of a genuine obsession, a thematic center that every character orbits without necessarily recognizing that it's what they're actually talking about. Thorin wants Erebor as home, not just as kingdom or inheritance or treasure source, but as the place his people belong, the place their identity is anchored, the place they can be themselves fully, rather than the diminished, exiled, mercenary versions of themselves they've been living as for 60 years. The dragon sickness is, in this reading, what happens when the desire for home curdles into something that no longer looks like home even after arrival. He gets Erebor back. And it doesn't feel like home because home isn't a place, the film argues with some insistence. It's a condition. A state of being known and knowing, of safety and belonging that cannot be inherited or reclaimed or purchased. It has to be lived into, slowly, through ordinary time and ordinary relationship. The treasure can't provide that. Only the people can. And Thorin, in his madness, has been pushing the people away. Bilbo's relationship with home is the film's other argument. He left the Shire voluntarily, dragged, technically, but some part of him answered the call, and spent a year discovering that he is larger than the life he'd arranged for himself. His heroism at every crucial moment of the trilogy is the heroism of a person who keeps discovering capacities he didn't know he had, and then he goes home. Back to the Shire, back to Bag End, back to the armchair and the maps and the quiet, but not unchanged. And the film is precise about this. Returning home is not the same as going back. Bilbo sits in his chair in the final sequence, and the Shire is exactly as he left it, every neighbor and fence and garden plot in its rightful place, and he is different. He occupies the same space, and it fits differently now. The world didn't get bigger, he did. And carrying that expansion in the container of an ordinary life, finding a way to hold what happened without being consumed by it, without making it the only story you tell, is its own form of heroism. Quiet, sustained, invisible to everyone but yourself. This is why the film's final image matters so much. Not Bilbo triumphant, not Bilbo mourning, Bilbo present, in his home, in his life, in the ordinary texture of a world he loves and returned to and will spend 60 more years in before we meet him again as an old man handing a ring to a nephew who will carry it into a darkness Bilbo never had to face. The Shire is Bilbo's choice. Not a consolation prize for surviving the adventure, A genuine, conscious, courageous choice to value the small, beautiful things enough to protect them and to live inside them fully rather than always looking toward the horizon. It's a case study in collective failure, in the specific catastrophe that results when multiple parties with legitimate grievances and incompatible certainties arrive at a shared space and discover that none of them has the capacity, in that moment, to see past their own claim. Every faction in the Battle of Five Armies is right about something. The men of Lake Town have a genuine claim to compensation. The elves of Mirkwood have a genuine claim to their gems. The dwarves of Erebor have a genuine right to their ancestral home. Even Dian's Iron Hills dwarves, who know the least about the full situation, are acting in good faith by coming to support their kin. The tragedy isn't that any of them is wrong. It's that being right, in the particular combination of circumstances the film has assembled, is insufficient to prevent catastrophe. Rightness without the capacity for compromise isn't righteousness. It's a weapon. What breaks the impasse isn't negotiation or wisdom or any of the political solutions that Gandalf, Bard, and Bilbo have been attempting. It's Azog, an external threat, indifferent to every grievance in the valley, interested only in strategic control of a mountain that nobody had remembered to think of as a military asset. The orcs don't care about treasure or gems or compensation. They care about position, and in arriving to take it, they inadvertently accomplish what none of the other factions managed. They create a common enemy. This is one of the film's quieter and more cynical observations. Cooperation isn't produced by shared values or shared wisdom in Five Armies. It's produced by shared threat. The dwarves and elves and men who are on the edge of killing each other over a pile of gold suddenly discover, with remarkable efficiency, how to fight alongside each other, because the alternative to cooperation is extinction. Political will, the film suggests, tends to become available when the consequences of its absence become sufficiently personal, not before. This is not an optimistic observation, but it's an honest one, and Tolkien was fundamentally an honest writer for all his mythology. A man who had seen the First World War take an entire generation of his friends and who understood, from the inside, how catastrophically ordinary the mechanisms of collective violence actually are. The Battle of Five Armies, in its bones, is a story about that understanding, about how easily legitimate claims and wounded pride and political calculation can produce a valley full of bodies. The eucatastrophe and its cost. Tolkien coined the term eucatastrophe, the sudden, joyful turn in a narrative where things seem darkest, where the grace note arrives that prevents final catastrophe. It's the structural move that underlies the eagle's arriving. The return of Beorn. The moment the tide turns. Tolkien believed these moments were the highest form of narrative, the closest that story could come to conveying something true about the nature of grace. Battle of the Five Armies delivers the eucatastrophe. The eagles arrive. The battle turns. The evil is defeated. These are the genre's promises kept, and then it pays the cost. What Tolkien also understood, and what Peter Jackson's adaptation honors in its final sequences, is that eucatastrophe is not the same as resolution. The joy of the turn doesn't cancel the grief of what was lost in the darkness before it. Thorin is still dead. Fili and Kili are still dead. The battle is over, and the valley is full of everything that violence leaves behind. The grace note doesn't revise the tragedy. It arrives alongside it, in the same breath, inseparable. That simultaneity, the survival and the loss existing together, neither canceling the other, is the thematic signature of Tolkien's worldview, and it's what gives Battle of the Five Armies its emotional texture in the aftermath sequences. Bilbo walks home carrying both. The quest succeeded. The friends are dead. The world is safer. The price was enormous. All of it is true at the same time, and the film has the honesty and the courage to let it all be true simultaneously, rather than selecting the version that provides comfortable closure. That refusal of comfort is where Five Armies, at its thematic best, becomes something genuinely meaningful rather than merely entertaining. It uses the enormous resources of franchise filmmaking, the spectacle, the scale, the decade and a half of accumulated audience investment, to deliver a story that ends the way important stories end, not with answers, but with the right questions, not with resolution, but with the truth that some costs can't be refunded. Some losses are permanent. Some victories are worth paying for anyway. That's not a fantasy argument. That's a human one. And those are the only arguments that last. December 2014. The reviews land 66% on Rotten Tomatoes. The weakest critical reception of any Jackson Middle-earth film. Complaints about bloat, about CGI excess, about a children's novel stretched past its natural shape. A disappointing conclusion, more spectacle than story. The Hobbit trilogy ends with a whimper dressed as a bang. The critical consensus assembled quickly and calcified just as fast, and the narrative it produced, that the Hobbit trilogy was a commercially motivated dilution of the Lord of the Rings legacy, And that Battle of the Five Armies was its most diluted installment, became the received wisdom within weeks of the film's release. That narrative isn't entirely wrong, it's just incomplete. And the way it's incomplete is interesting. What the 2014 critical conversation consistently underweighted, what most of the negative reviews either missed or didn't have the frame to discuss, was the performance work at the film's center. Richard Armitage's Thorin and Martin Freeman's Bilbo were doing something in this film that the blockbuster genre rarely asks of its actors, and rarer still receives with this level of commitment and craft. But the critical apparatus applied to franchise spectacle in 2014 wasn't well calibrated to recognize it. The conversation was about whether the battle was too long, whether the CGI was too obvious, whether 3 films were justified by the source material. It wasn't, by and large, a conversation about what Armitage does in the parapet scene or what Freeman carries in his expression during the farewell to the company. The craft was present. The critical attention to it was not. The box office and what it measured, Battle of the Five Armies earned $962 million worldwide against an estimated $300 million production budget, making it the second highest grossing film of 2014, trailing only Transformers: Age of Extinction. It was the lowest grossing of the 3 Hobbit films domestically, reflecting an audience that had been partially eroded by the mixed reception of The Desolation of Smaug, but it performed robustly in international markets where the fantasy epic genre had maintained stronger enthusiasm throughout the trilogy. The box office numbers told a complicated story. On one hand, nearly $1 billion represents enormous commercial success by any absolute standard. On the other, measured against the Lord of the Rings films adjusted for inflation and against the franchise's own early projections, the Hobbit trilogy's commercial performance traced a declining arc that the studios, the critics, and eventually the public interpreted as a verdict on the creative choices involved. What that verdict obscured was the degree to which the Hobbit films, including this one, were operating in a fundamentally different cultural context from the Lord of the Rings films a decade earlier. The Lord of the Rings arrived before the franchise era fully crystallized, before the MCU had trained audiences to expect a specific kind of blockbuster emotional register, before the cultural conversation about adaptation fidelity had become as precise and adversarial as it later became. The Hobbit films were measured against a standard they hadn't helped set and couldn't fully meet, not because they were failures, but because the bar had been defined by their predecessors in ways that precluded fair comparison. 10 years later, the reassessment in progress. Something interesting has happened to The Battle of the Five Armies in the decade since its release. Gradually, in the way that films sometimes do when the immediate context of their arrival fades and the work itself can be seen more clearly, it has begun to be reassessed. 9. Part of this reassessment is generational. Viewers who were 12 or 13 when they saw it in theaters in 2014 are in their mid-20s now, old enough to return to it with the analytical tools they've since developed, young enough to still have the emotional memory of what the experience of seeing it for the first time felt like. For this cohort, Battle of the Five Armies isn't a disappointment relative to a superior predecessor. It's a complete emotional experience in its own right, encountered before the cultural baggage calcified, processed with the full weight of childhood feeling that certain films get to carry permanently. The critical reassessment, slower to arrive, has been picking up pace. Film essayists and YouTubers, ironically, exactly the kind of long-form video essay creators that a script like this one is written for, have been doing the work that 2014 criticism didn't, spending time with the performances, examining the thematic architecture, taking seriously the proposition that a blockbuster fantasy film can contain genuine psychological complexity without that complexity negating or being negated by its spectacle. The extended editions have helped. They exist in the cultural ecosystem now, in a way they didn't in December 2014, when the theatrical cut was the only widely available version and the extended material existed only as a rumored future release. Viewers who approach the extended Battle of the Five Armies as a starting point rather than a revision find a film that breathes more naturally, that trusts its quieter sequences more completely, that resembles the movie the creative team was clearly trying to make before runtime negotiations with distributors intervened. None of this is to claim that the film is misunderstood genius. It has real problems. The structural decision to expand a single-chapter climax into a film-length event requires padding that occasionally shows. Alfred remains a tonal miscalculation that the extended edition actually makes worse by giving him more screen time. The Dol Guldur sequence, for all its visual ambition, sits awkwardly against the more grounded emotional register of everything around it, solving a narrative problem the trilogy created for itself rather than one that organically emerges from the story. These are legitimate criticisms, and they don't dissolve in the warm water of reassessment. What reassessment does is provide the corrective to dismissal. The film is not the failure it was processed as in 2014. It is a flawed, ambitious, often genuinely moving conclusion to a massively imperfect and intermittently magnificent creative undertaking. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. Good criticism holds them both. What Jackson's Middle-earth built 14 years. 6 films, hundreds of hours of production footage, thousands of craftspeople, one of the largest sustained collaborative creative endeavors in the history of popular cinema. What? Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and the extended family of the Weta organizations built across those 14 years, beginning with the Fellowship of the Ring in 2001 and ending with the final frames of Battle of the Five Armies in 2014, is not accurately described as a franchise. Franchises are business models. What this was, at its best, was a sustained act of creative translation, taking a literary world that existed in the imaginations of millions of readers and giving it a shared visual language so complete and so specific that it now exists as a genuine cultural location, a place that people who have never opened a Tolkien novel can visit and recognize. That's rarer than it sounds. Most adaptations produce versions. This is what one filmmaker thought the book looked like. Jackson's Middle-earth produced the version, the one against which all subsequent Tolkien-related creative work is measured, sometimes fairly and sometimes not, but always inevitably. When Amazon produced The Rings of Power in 2022, the aesthetic and emotional standard it was measured against wasn't Tolkien's text, it was Jackson's films. That's the definition of cultural imprint, when the adaptation becomes the reference. Battle of the Five Armies is the last word of that imprint, the final image in the album. Everything that follows, the retrospectives, the reappraisals, the streaming revisitations, the inevitable future adaptations, follows from what this film concluded. Andrew Lesnie never worked on another film after this one. Howard Shore's Middle-earth compositional system, that vast, intricately organized musical world, has no new material to add to it. The Weta teams that built Smaug and Erebor and the armies of 5 factions have moved on to other projects, other worlds, other clients. The specific collaboration that produced these 6 films is over in the same way that very particular human configurations are always over once the circumstances that produced them change. It cannot be reassembled. The people are different now. The world is different. The moment was the moment and it has passed. The mountain, the Hobbit, the door. Here is what stays. The image of a dragon falling from a night sky into a dark lake. The sound of a dwarven king singing about a mountain his people lost and needed back. A small person in a large world, discovering that small people in large worlds are sometimes exactly what large worlds need. The eagles arriving when you thought it was over. A king dying in snow, himself again, finally, too late and just in time. A door closing on an ordinary life that carries the weight of an extraordinary one. These images have entered the common visual vocabulary of a generation the same way that certain pieces of music enter the body, not as information, but as feeling, as memory, as the specific texture of being in a particular place at a particular age when something beautiful happened in the dark and left a mark. People who saw the Battle of the Five Armies in theaters at 14 carry it differently than people who approach it now for the first time at 30. Neither experience is more valid. Both are real. Cinema's strange temporal magic, the way a film can exist simultaneously as the moment you first saw it and as the thing it is now and as all the moments of return between, operates here with full force. The Hobbit trilogy will continue to be debated. The 3-film structure will continue to be litigated. The question of what a more disciplined adaptation might have achieved will continue to be posed, reasonably, by people who love Tolkien and found the films wanting. All of that is legitimate. All of that is part of what it means for a work to exist in the culture and matter enough to argue about. But the Battle of the Five Armies, specifically this film, this ending, this particular collaboration between Jackson's vision and Armitage's grief and Freeman's quiet heroism and Shore's irreplaceable music, did something that the critical conversation at its release didn't fully credit, and that time is gradually correcting. It ended something enormous with genuine feeling. Not perfectly, not without compromise, but with care. For the story, for the characters, for the world, and for the audience that had been living in that world for over a decade and deserved a goodbye that meant something. There's a shot near the very end of the film. Bilbo, standing at the round green door of Bag End, key in hand. He's been away a year. The door is exactly as he left it. He opens it, steps in, and the camera stays outside for just a moment. watching the light from inside spill briefly into the gray morning before the door closes and Bag End is quiet again. That exterior shot, held for just a second too long to be accidental, is the film saying something that no dialogue could carry. Every journey ends at a door. What you carry through it is yours. The world that waits on the other side of coming home is both the same world you left and permanently altered by the fact that you left it. The Shire doesn't know what happened. Bilbo does. The door closes. The light disappears. The world goes quiet. And somewhere beyond the frame, in the space that great stories open in the imagination and never fully close, the mountain still stands. It always will.